Took a break for a couple years because I drew a bit more heat than I had the time to deal with in the midst of a whole bunch of major life decisions. But I think that I'm going to need to have an ego death of sorts with respect to the content that I had intended to make at that time and the stuff that I'm probably going to be trying to make now. Not to say I won't ever get around to Atlas and that stuff, but I think the framework for discussing how that pattern of behavior manifests and how it presents itself as a false messiah, as a false way to live, I don't think I have what I need for that yet, still. I thought I had a bunch already sorted out, but I don't think I do. And so that's going to be put on hold. So in the meantime, I'm going to do other stuff, despite having said, my next video is going to be X, Y, or Z. We're not worried about that. Since I had been posting content, we've moved about 800 miles. I quit my career and found a new one. We're in a house. I've still got my family. Things have been rough because we basically threw away everything we had. The comfort that comes from getting to a certain point in life, having achieved certain things in life, and being able to rely on that, throwing it all away post-COVID, throwing all that away and starting over was rough. And that was able to prompt a change which needed to happen. I don't recommend trying to force that kind of a change. And a lot of people yearned for that kind of a change. When I told people what we were doing, a lot of people wanted the same thing for themselves. They wanted to reset everything as well. But there were attachments that they had, real and imaginary, that prevented them from making that jump, from taking that leap. Just, all right, God, we're going to make a choice. We're going to go someplace where we have no connections at all and try and see if we can make it work. And by the grace of God, it's worked well enough. Our needs are met. Certainly not all of our wants. The thing that I was pondering about myself and wanted to share today is covet God's love, not God's knowledge. So there is a desire that we have in many cases to know and to understand and to have answers for things. And we think, even those who are not believers, we think, if we have an answer, that will solve the problem. And it's not too much different than thinking, if I buy this toy, or if I get into this hobby, then I'll be fine. And it's not completely off base in the sense that having downtime is a good thing. Being able to enjoy something new is fun. That's not bad in and of itself. But if we cultivate a yearning for what we don't have, that yearning isn't going to be satisfied by now having it, because we've cultivated that desire, the thought process of, I'll be good when. And what happens is that when happens, we're not satisfied because we spent all this time looking forward to a moment, building it up in our minds, and now we need something else that we're building up towards as well. The anticlimactic reality of most things that we look forward to in this life is what prevents us from being able to genuinely yearn for something and have it work out in the long run. And so knowledge is one of those things where, like I said, even non-believers will say, oh, if I just understood this about the faith, then I would believe. If I just understood this or had an answer for that. Lots of discussions about commands of God in the Old Testament, things that happened. Even within churches, people want to haggle over and debate things that the church is supposed to look like. Your smells and bells, your statements of faith, things of that sort. And I'm reminded of Paul in Corinthians when he talks about having all knowledge and understanding all mysteries, but not having love. He is a clanging cymbal or a sounding brass, or however the translation you like the most puts it. Basically, he's saying, at least 2,000, around 2,000 years ago at this point, he's saying that even if he did know all that stuff, it wouldn't matter. Even if he had answers to all of the questions that he could ask, it wouldn't matter. And I think that's in part because we don't understand how those answers work. We don't understand that those answers aren't universal. They're not going to be applicable beyond the question that was just asked. And so when we covet God's knowledge, we build ourselves up thinking, oh, well, if I just have more of the knowledge, if I have more of what God has, then I could be more like God. And the problem is that what God has revealed to us, what God has actually given to us, is not more knowledge. He hasn't given us answers in the way that we like to think of answers. Fifth grade math test, there's a set of correct answers to every question on that math test. But that set of answers isn't going to be useful in sixth grade, let alone when you get to, multivariable vector calculus if you ever end up going to college. Having answers feels good. There's a certainty in 2 + 2 = 4. But what if now what you're dealing with is the square root of 21? 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't help. And a lot of the answers people think that they have don't affect how they live on a day-to-day basis. Take something like the Trinity. Whatever actually exists probably isn't going to change whether or not you're going to drive the speed limit today. Right? The moment that the Holy Spirit indwells you, is that going to change whether you actually click onto that website or not? Or you have one too many drinks? Or you respond to the text that you probably shouldn't respond to? We keep trying to collect answers, thinking that if we have enough of them, we'll be good. Like that'll solve something. And we're half right in that we've solved the problem that prompted the need for that answer, but there's going to be new problems that show up. There's going to be need for new answers. And at the outset, that might seem messed up. It might seem heretical. But the problem is that the answers we had were based on an incomplete sight of the truth. We don't see everything the way that God does. And so when we covet God's knowledge, when we covet what God knows, what God perceives, all that kind of stuff, it doesn't help us. We think if we understand X, Y, or Z better, that'll solve the problems that we have in front of us, despite the fact that the process that we're going through is completely unrelated. And an example might be, I can study all day long about how to change the oil on my wife's vehicle. Her oil filter is in the engine bay on the driver's side of the vehicle. My personal vehicle, the oil filter is on the passenger side, accessible from the wheel well. You don't get into the engine bay. There are two right answers that are not mutually exclusive, But if I'm trying to tell my wife how to change her oil from the perspective of my vehicle or the answers that I have for my vehicle, it's not going to work. And it's not because what I have said or told her is wrong. It's because the application is wrong. The context is different. And so often we covet God's knowledge thinking that, oh, well, if we had the knowledge of somebody who wasn't context dependent in the way that we are, that would somehow solve problems. But did all that God know prevent the Garden of Eden? Did it prevent the crucifixion of Christ? Or maybe what we're supposed to do is understand that, or at least come to understand that, the knowledge isn't what makes God special in the grand scheme of things at the end of the day. Knowledge isn't the thing of God that we should be coveting and desiring for ourselves that we do not yet have. If anything, we should be coveting God's love. Because God's love is why Adam and Eve got the skins. God's love is why Christ died on the cross. God's love is why there is an offer made to all to believe. And that's why Paul in Corinthians talks about love being so much better than all the other things that people might seek after. If we covet God's love and we seek to get that for ourselves, the mentality behind that is very different, because what we're seeking to do is not just have something, because love is demonstrated, it's lived, it's done. It doesn't just exist. A rock on the side of the road doesn't have love. But a child that picks up the rock and draws a face on it and now has an interaction with the rock, now the rock can experience love. It's the interaction where love can exist. And so if what we are coveting is God's ability to interact in the most charitable way possible, if what we're coveting is the ability for God to have an answer because of love and not knowledge, that's going to put us on a very different trajectory. We're not going to be focused on having answers. We're going to be focused on behaving like God would in a particular circumstance. And if God is staring at the face of his enemies on the cross and saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, if we're told time and again to love God and then love our neighbors as ourselves, what we're pursuing is not an answer. What we're pursuing is a process. It's a way of being. It's a way of living. And the hunger that we have for that ultimate goal actually does benefit us. If we want to live as Christ lived, if we want to follow him, that's a good thing. I don't think God's the only one who can have jealousy or other traits that we normally consider to be negative if the subject of those feelings and emotions drives us towards a direction that we need to be going in. So if you find yourself coveting God's knowledge, if you find yourself trying to have answers, try and covet something else instead. Covet how God gets answers instead of the answers that God gets. Because if you are coveting that and you're pursuing that, you're going to learn how God thinks. And the way you do that is because of the Holy Spirit showing you. It's kind of a weird thing when we talk about God as being some distant, far-off entity when we will teach that God is omnipresent, for example. If God is spirit and is not constrained to a physical existence, God is on the other side of this screen just as much as he is on this side of the screen. So where do you go to follow Christ? Do you go and try and find him somewhere else outside? Or do you believe, and when the Bible tells us that Christ is then inside us, whether from that moment or now we've just realized it or whatever that ends up being, we don't go out looking for answers. We go in to get guidance on how to behave, on what it looks like if we had the love of God. And in that process, we gain it. We do learn to have our own version, our own ability to see and perceive in the way that God would see and perceive. We can learn to love others the way that God has loved us. And we don't have answers, but we have the best way to get answers. If you've got that 5th grade math test and you're trying to move towards multivariable vector calculus, you don't study the answers to the 5th grade math test. You complicate and you build upon the process of addition, multiplication, subtraction, division, all that kind of stuff. You don't lose those answers. They don't stop being correct, but you realize the limited scope that they apply to. So my petition, my encouragement would be to covet God's love if you have to covet something, and then realize that what you're coveting isn't a fixed point. There is no actual achievement until the future date when what we see has been changed completely. Understand that coveting God's love is a good thing because it's going to drive us towards manifesting it for ourselves. And even if we try to steal it, even if we try to repurpose it for ourselves, to apprehend it for ourselves, the consequences that come from living in a way that is self-sacrificial, it's going to be really hard for anybody to try and frame that as somehow being selfish. You can't selfishly live in a genuinely self-sacrificial way. I think that's all I've got for now. Take care. May God bless you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.